G'day everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the AskTomTech show. This week we're going to be talking about passwords, and do you need them? Should you have them? How strong should they be? So we constantly are getting, well, more so now, passwords are the things that attackers are going after. Passwords are the gateway to everything that you're doing. So you're using your passwords to access your internet banking, your social media, but more so if we look at it in the business environment, you need your password to log onto your computer, log into your email, log on to your finance system, whatever it is, you've typically got a username and password. Now, traditionally, we would have seen passwords used and have some extra complexity developed into them. So that might be, it needs to be a minimum of 8 or 10 characters. You need to have an uppercase, you need to have a number, you need to have a non-alpha numeric character in there. And that still very much applies. But what we're seeing now is those passwords, even though themselves are quite secure and generally in a pretty good state, so they're not going to get cracked easily, but with the spate of phishing style attacks and people looking to capture those passwords, they're getting stolen so much easier. So what we see is you get sent an email that says click on this link to download your files. Might be from Google, it might be from Office 365, wherever it is, but it's a fake email which redirects you to a fake looking site. But that site looks like Google or it looks like Microsoft. So what do? You enter in your username and you enter in your password. It doesn't go anywhere, but now what's happened is that the attacker has your username and password. And they know that that's either for your Google or for your Office 365. So what's the first thing they're doing? They're logging into your email and having a look around and see what's there. Now, having the strongest password of all time is not going to prevent that. So how can you prevent it? And that's sort of the challenges that clients are facing now, is how do we stop and how do we protect those passwords? Now, we would obviously recommend that you have your password policy set so your passwords and your users change your passwords every 60 or 90 days. And what that'll mean is that if some password was stolen and you had a compromised account, that within that 90 days, that password's going to get changed. Now, 90 days is a long time, or even 60 days for someone to have access to your email system. But look, it's better than nothing. However, once someone's got access to your email system, they're doing all sorts of stuff in there, and they're using that to compromise either your internal team or even your suppliers and partners. So it's not a great look. And to really combat, you're going to be changing passwords way too often to stop that. So what we need to be looking at is other methods of authentication. So moving away or moving towards a method of logging in that requires multiple different types of authentication. So what we call that is two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. And essentially what that is you will maintain your username, you'll maintain the password, and that password we would still say you would change every 60 to 90 days. But in addition to that, when you're going into particular services and you enter in your username and password, you're then challenged for a third piece of information. Now that's typically like a dongle or a number that will rotate on a little dongle. You may be familiar with that with your banking systems. RSA tokens, that's what they're called. You could get an SMS message that sends you a code that you need to enter into the website. Or you can have an app on your phone that actually you need to authenticate with either clicking approve or grabbing the number that shows up there. There's multiple different ways that this can be done. And that's where that multi-factor authentication comes in. So what that means from a security perspective is that if your username and password does get stolen and someone then attempts to log into that platform, let's take Office 365 as an example, you've accidentally gone to a dodgy site, you've entered in your username and password, that's now been captured by the attacker. If you have multi-factor authentication turned on your account and in your system, if that attacker then tries to log into the Office 365 platform, they're not going to be able to, because the system's going to prompt them for that third piece of authentication, it's going to prompt them for that code or that SMS, which means they're not going to get in. Now, that's great. Your system has been protected, which is exactly what you want it to do. Now, it's not always possible in systems, so you've got to look at what your systems support, how people are logging into them, where they're logging into them, and you need to keep in mind that you don't want people to be challenged for that second authentication every time they're in the office necessarily, because you would hope that it can get quite frustrating. So you've got to look at how and when you implement that, but definitely it is something that has to be turned on. Now, the multi-factor authentication around passwords can be extended to all sorts of different things. You'll see it on your iPhones, for example. You have a thumbprint that you need to put in. Now, that's a biometric sort of factor authentication. Without your finger or your thumb, you can't get into your iPad or your iPhone. And you can obviously link that to then have multi-levels. So if you're logging into your phone, you have your 4-digit code or your 6-digit code and your thumbprint, and away you go. Similarly, logging into your computer these days, we can do things around biometric login. So actually, instead of having a password, we can have a PIN number, 4 or 6 digits, and use either a fingerprint, but more so now use the camera and actually do facial recognition to log you in to your computer. Now, that's taking the security to that next level, which is where we have to look at. Passwords are still really, really important, and they need to be strong and they need to be changed. But we're seeing a transition to actually not even using passwords in some instances and using this biometric or facial recognition platform to get in. Now, that's great when you're on your PC and you're on a PC that you manage and it's securing access to that corporate device. But you're still going to want to have those additional layers of protection for when you're trying to access, and I use Office 365 as an example, because you can access all that data and all those systems remotely. You can go to the Corners Club and log in, but you want to make sure you're logging in securely. You want to make sure that you're being challenged for that multi-factor authentication, that code or the approval on your phone to get in, because that's where we're seeing a lot of attacks come in. The surface area of attacks is really focused around that email. People will send a link, they'll get to capture your email details, they'll then log into your email, they'll set up some sort of email forwarder, so silently in the background that your email is being redirected to an outside party, unless that's being monitored and managed, which is another discussion. You're not necessarily going to know that you're missing those emails. And what they do is they then monitor the conversations and monitor what's happening, learn about your organization, and then they jump into that conversation with dodgy information. And it's sometimes like here's a new bank detail you need to pay an invoice onto. And it's alarming how often that actually happens, is that people pay an invoice to the wrong account and that money's gone. So, and that's purely been from an email compromised password. 9 times out of 10, that's how they've got in, is via compromise in your Google or your Office 365 email system, or even your internal email system, where someone has got access to that because the security and the controls around your username and password aren't strong enough. So what our recommendation is, if we go right back to the beginning, we're looking at usernames and passwords. They're going to be in place. They're going to be maintained. You're always going to have them. Look at what systems you're using usernames and passwords to log into, and can you make that a stronger password? Can you make that a requirement to change that password more regularly? But more so, are there ways that you can then look at implementing an additional layer of protection on your passwords with that multi-factor authentication? So have that email, that SMS, the application authorize that next level before you get access. You can then extend that to certain devices where we start looking at biometric scanning or facial recognition, and that'll protect the actual device and the ability to log into that. So if you do, lose your Surface or something like that, your Surface Pro, and you've got your facial recognition set up, no one's going to be able to log into that machine, or even if they know your password, they're still not going to get in. However, unless the data's encrypted, that could still be accessed. Again, another discussion. So we're looking at layers here. But strong username, strong passwords, 8 to 10 characters minimum, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, non-alpha characters. Implement multi-factor authentication. look at making sure that multi-factor authentication has some controls around it so people aren't bombarded with that request every time they log in, particularly if they're in the office or a known location. Look at ways to make that, and we talk about conditional access, so it prompts when there's a difference in the way that you're authenticating. And then extend that out to more biometric and enforcing securities on your devices. So there's a number of different ways to tackle it. Passwords are here to stay for a little bit longer yet. Not everything supports the facial recognition. If you've got to have a password, have it multi-factored. Look at where your other systems are accessible from and how you get into those. And then extend that out to some sort of biometric or even facial recognition on your devices. So that's our tip around password management for today, and I hope you got something out of it, and we'll catch up with you next time.